the US has confirmed that it has conducted additional strikes on Iran-linked Houthi rebels. This comes as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to West Asia once again on a new crisis tour of the region. Blinken seeks to push forward a proposal to halt the devastating conflict in return for the release of hostages. This will be Blinken's fifth visit to the tense region since the October 7th attack. The top American diplomat will visit Israel, Egypt and Qatar as part of the US diplomatic push to prevent a wider conflict. A major focus of this trip will be to push a proposal that calls for pauses in fighting in exchange for the release of hostages. The proposal under discussion was drafted last week in Paris during talks involving the CIA chief and Israeli, Qatari and Egyptian officials. Sources say the text envisages a first phase of a 40-day ceasefire. As part of this plan, during this time, Hamas will free remaining hostages. And that's in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Although, according to the US National Security Advisor, the hostage release deal is exclusive. Jake Sullivan says an agreement to pause the war and free hostages captured by Hamas isn't imminent. He says the ball is now in Hamas's court. The Biden administration is also gradually showing more frustration with Israel. On Thursday, the US had imposed sanctions on extremist settlers in the West Bank. And now, Canada will too impose sanctions on Israeli settlers who incite violence in the West Bank. This, according to Canada's foreign minister. Ottawa will also introduce new sanctions on Hamas leaders. The Israeli army has also released footage which shows Israeli troops conducting raids at Hamas facilities in Gaza's Khan Yunis. During the raid, the IDF says they were able to find weapons kept by Hamas militants. Further adding, the Israeli troops in Khan Yunis were able to seize a Hamas compound where they killed several gunmen. Although WION was not able to independently verify the location or the date of when these videos were filmed. Well, for more on this, we're joined as ever by our correspondent Jody Cohen, joining us live from Rana. And Jody, thanks for your time this morning. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken back in the region once again. It's his fifth visit since the war started. What's on the agenda this time?
Hi, Oliver. Yes, so Secretary of State Blinken is visiting Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, Israel and the West Bank. And the State Department has given an indication of the agenda, and there seems to be four key agenda items. Number one is working to prevent the spread of the conflict in the region, while they say reaffirming the US rights to defend their personnel and the rights to freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. Now, this, of course, is against the backdrop of US retaliatory strikes against Iranian proxy groups in Syria, Iraq and Yemen. Now, the second issue is to discuss how to establish a lasting security for Israelis and Palestinians, with reports suggesting that the State Department is considering what's being called the Biden Doctrine, which is to recognize a Palestinian state once the war is over and the Palestinians make reforms. And Netanyahu has indicated that the Palestinian Authority needs to stop funding, teaching and supporting terrorism. The third issue is talks on a humanitarian pause, enabling more aid to reach Gazan civilians. Now, the UN Agency for the Palestinians, UNRWA, has said more aid needs to enter Gaza. Israel has said that there's no limit to the amount of aid it can inspect, that the bottleneck is with UN agencies. And remember, numerous countries now have paused their funding of UNRWA while investigations are going into alleged links between Hamas and UNRWA. And the fourth issue, of course, is the continued diplomatic efforts to try to secure the release of the remaining 136 hostages, 6 of whom are American citizens who are still being held captive in Gaza. Now, remember, it's been more than 120 days since the 7th of October when Hamas took these hostages, including the youngest, Kfir Bibas, who's just turned 1 year old.
Well, talking about those hostages, how close are we that there are indications that we could be close to a deal for the release of them?
So we're seeing mixed messages. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said that a hostage deal is not right around the corner. He suggested it's not clear when or if a deal might come together. The proposal being discussed would include, as you said, a pause in fighting that potentially could be extended up to more than 4 months, releasing a number of Palestinian security prisoners in exchange for Hamas releasing the hostages in stages. Israel has reportedly accepted the proposal. There were reports that Hamas had suggested it would respond on Sunday evening, but there's still no confirmation of their response. Hamas is reportedly making further demands, such as calling for a permanent ceasefire and the release of high-profile prisoners like Marwan Barghouti, who's serving multiple life sentences in prison for his involvement in 3 terror attacks. Now, these conditions are not part of the proposal, as they would leave Hamas in power, and Hamas has said that it would carry out more 7th of October-style attacks against Israelis. But in a possible indication that a deal could potentially be reached, Israel's health ministry has published new protocols for released hostages. Now, these would include training for treating torture victims and sexual abuse victims. And that comes following accounts from some of the hostages who were released in the first agreement, as well as the doctors who treated them. In the meantime, the IDF has said that they've killed dozens of Hamas terrorists in the past 24 hours. And Israel believes that military pressure is ultimately what's going to lead Hamas to agree a deal.
Jodie Cohen, thank you very much for the insight there. Our reporter Jodie Cohen joining us from Ra'anah.